everyone, and thanks for tuning in to BEaTS Research Radio, a podcast and YouTube channel dedicated to bringing our community closer to research in the science and engineering fields. I'm Hallie Arnott, and I'm going to be your host on today's episode. Joining us is Dr. Jhonathan Romero Fontalvo, the lead of professional services and co-founder of Zapata Computing. Dr. Romero obtained his PhD from Harvard, working with the Aspiro Guzik Group. His research focused on chemical physics and was centered on developing variational quantum algorithms for quantum simulation and machine learning. He is now at Zapata Computing, and Dr. Romero coordinates the development and quantum algorithms and software solutions to tackle real-world problems. Today, he's here to speak to us about quantum computing and how we're using it today. Dr. Romero, thank you so much for joining us here today on BEaTS Research Radio.
Well, thank you, Hallie, for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Great. So thanks again. And I'd like to start by asking you, how would you explain quantum computing to someone who is completely unfamiliar with the field?
Okay, so I guess I should start saying that quantum computing is a new model of computation that essentially exploits the properties of quantum mechanical systems to represent and process information in ways that allow us to solve certain problems faster than we could using other types of computers. So there are like three important properties that goes into quantum computing that are properties associated to quantum mechanical systems. Those are essentially superposition, interference, and entanglement. So I know that it sounds, it could be a little bit packed, so let me try to unpack that a little bit. So the basic idea of quantum mechanics is that the world is described as a superposition of all the possible states a system could take. So take, for example, let's take, for example, a bit, the classical bit for information, right? A single bit could be either 0 or 1. There are no other potential states that it could take. A quantum bit, instead, is in a superposition of 0 and 1, meaning that the state of that system is described as a linear combination of those two states, essentially. And then in that sense, the representation is probabilistic because it could be certain percentage to think that way in 0 and certain percentage in 1. Now, what is special about probabilities in quantum systems is that it's not quite a probabilistic description in the classical sense of probabilities. You know that probabilities could be are positive in general, but probabilities in quantum systems are actually described in terms of amplitudes, which are those two numbers in that linear combination. And amplitudes can be negative. In fact, they are, in general, they could be complex numbers. And then when you have that condition, that brings sort of special properties to quantum systems. So one example of that is what is called interference. So the idea is that if you have a system that supposes undergoing two different paths, and in one of those paths, the amplitude associated to one state is negative, and in the other path, the amplitude associated to the same state is positive, then overall, those two amplitudes will cancel out. And because of that cancellation, overall, that system will never be in that state. So that essentially is the property of interference. The other property quantum mechanical systems have is entanglement, which is this idea that, in a quantum state, suppose you have, let's say, many qubits, many of these quantum bits. In those quantum states, some of these quantum bits are connected in a way in which the outcome of observing the system shows certain level of correlation. So let me give you an example. So when you have a quantum system that is in superposition, you cannot really see the superposition. You will have to, what we call, measure the system or observe the system. And the moment you observe the system, you are going to see, suppose if it is a qubit, a single qubit, you're going to see either 0 or 1. But then you're going to, if you measure many times the same system, you are going to observe 0 and 1 with a probability that is proportional to the square amplitude or the square magnitude of the amplitude associated to the state. So that probability could be, 50-50, for instance. If I have two entangled qubits, there might be, there might be in a state in which the outcome of measuring the two qubits are correlated. So if I measure the first one, I get a 0. Then the second, I measure the second one, and I also get a 0. Or if the first one is 1, then the second one will always be 1. This is the type of correlation that is generated by entanglement. So that is in a very briefly what those three properties are about. So really, quantum computers are computers that exploit those three properties: interference, entanglement, and superposition, to do computation. And the advantage that we might get from them is that certain problems, when solved using quantum computers, we could find solutions that are essentially faster. Examples of those problems are factoring, for which people have discovered algorithms that are exponentially faster compared to the algorithms that you can run in a classical computer, and on a structure search, which is which essentially in which we found essentially a square square root advantage in searching. So yeah, I mean, in general, that's the idea behind quantum computers.
So how would you explain the difference then? It sounds like quantum computing is similar to computing, but it's got this little extra oomph of that computing doesn't have. So what would be the difference between a quantum computer and a computer that someone would have in their home?
Yeah, so really the difference is in those three properties. So the fact, for example, that you can be in superposition, right, allows you to, I guess maybe we could put it in terms of how difficult it would be to simulate a quantum computing. Maybe that will give people some idea of what these computers are special. So I was telling you that a bit can be essentially in a superposition of two states, 0 and 1. Now imagine that you have two bits. In that case, you will need one amplitude per each possible assignment of the system. There are 4 possible assignments of the system: 0, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 0, and 1, 1. So for one qubit, you need 2 amplitudes, which are 2 complex numbers. For 2 qubits, you need 4 amplitudes, which are 4 complex numbers. To describe the state of 3 qubits, now you need 8 amplitudes, and so on. So if you have 10 qubits, then I will need over 1,000 amplitudes to describe the state of the system. So the amount of information that I need to describe a quantum system grows exponentially with the number of qubits. And therefore, simulating a quantum computing will require actually exponential resources. So the amount of information that you can, that is representative of quantum systems is huge. And in that sense, quantum computers are more powerful than classical computers. Now, the tricky thing is being able to extract information from quantum computers. That's the part that gets tricky, because you are only able to read information. You will observe the solutions in a quantum computer with a probability that is proportional to that amplitude. So if that amplitude is too small, then it will be essentially like sampling randomly the space of possible solutions. So a lot of the work that goes into designing quantum algorithms is actually, designing a series of operations of the quantum computer that will allow you to amplify the solution that you want, right? So by playing with the interference, for example, increasing the amplitude of the solution and decreasing the amplitudes of the wrong answers for a problem.
Okay, so at Zapata Computing, is this your goal, exactly what you explained, or do you have some other goals at Zapata Computing?
Yeah, so at Zapata Computing, we are dedicated to design quantum algorithms, but we are focused on designing quantum algorithms for enterprise customers. So really, we want to essentially identify what are those problems, real world problems in industry that could benefit from quantum computing technologies. And in many industries, across many industries, there are very hard problems. So if you take, for instance, the problems that you typically encounter in supply chain, manufacturing, in the finance industry, trying to optimize, for example, portfolio optimization. All of these problems, routing, for instance, in delivery systems, all of these problems are hard optimization problems for which we actually don't have an efficient solution on a classical computer. Although there are many heuristic solutions or heuristic algorithms that we use to solve those problems, we don't have like an ultimate algorithm that could give you the best possible answer. And for that type of problems, quantum computers might offer alternative algorithms that could be either faster or could maybe provide a better solution for those optimization problems. And finding a better way of delivering goods or better structures for your supply chain or better portfolios immediately have an impact, right, on those industries. Another example of problems that could benefit from quantum computers are problems associated with simulation, in particular simulating quantum systems. So, in the chemical industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, we are interested in finding new materials or finding new small molecules that have certain activity, for example, in your body for curing an illness, right? And the process of designing those drugs, for instance, you would like to be able to simulate, right, before you go and synthesize the drug, how the drug is going to interact with your body. Is it really going to cure the illness, right? What is the level of activity of the drug? But small molecules are systems that behave quantum mechanically. So if you want to simulate them, you need to, in general, finding the exact solution will take exponential time on a classical computer. But using a quantum computer, you can simulate these systems natively, essentially, because you have a quantum system simulating another quantum system. So that is another example where quantum computing could have an impact. So at Zapata, we are looking for these hard problems that you find in industry, and we are designing quantum algorithms to tackle those problems. And in addition to designing the algorithms, we are also building software that would allow those companies to essentially build these quantum solutions, test them, and deploy them. That is in a nutshell what we are trying to accomplish.
That's very interesting. So for quantum computing, is the field at a stage yet where a quantum computer is able to solve problems that classic computers can't? Or are they just really able to get those, to do those computations a lot faster?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. So right now, quantum computing is sort of in a special regime that people call noisy intermediate scale quantum computing. And, the general idea goes like this. So going back to the discussion of what is quantum computing, right? If you think about just the model of quantum computing, you can take that model and analyze it. You can even design algorithms without ever touching a real quantum computer, right? Just based on how the computational model works. But if we want to apply these algorithms, we need to implement that quantum computation on a physical device. Now, the thing is that to implement a quantum computer, you need a system that behaves quantum mechanically. And then there is where it gets tricky, because systems that behave quantum mechanically are either systems that are very, very small, like atoms and molecules, or systems that are at very, very low temperatures. So to build a quantum computer, you need to use, for example, atoms. You need to be able to isolate atoms and control them very well. And that is, from the engineering point of view, that is very challenging. Another alternative for implementing quantum devices is using superconducting qubits. Superconducting qubits, which are essentially electrical circuits operated at very low temperatures. And at those temperatures, you observe superconducting behavior, and that is also a system that behaves quantumly. So these are, you can imagine that operating there at very low temperature or having to isolate atoms, is very challenging. And in essence, these systems are very fragile. In order to observe that quantum behavior, the system have to be isolated from the environment. But inevitably, you're going to have some errors happening in the quantum system because there's going to always be some level of interaction. So that is to say that physical implementations of quantum computers are noisy by nature. And there was a time in which people believed that realizing quantum computing was impossible because you always are going to have noise. This noise is going to accrue in the system, and then eventually that is going to destroy your computation. But people discovered a theory called quantum error correction, and later the theory of fault tolerance, that tells you that actually you can build quantum computers if your qubits are good enough. Essentially, if the level of noise is on their certain threshold level. Now, the advantage of fault-tolerant quantum computing is that you can essentially use the quantum computer in principle forever, right? You can have computations that are arbitrarily long. But it comes with a price, which is an overhead in the number of physical qubits that you need. So to implement, so now going back to your question, to have a quantum computer that is fully working, fault-tolerant quantum computer, you need in the orders of millions of qubits. Quantum computers today are only in the orders of 50, around 50, less than 100 qubits. So the plan is that we are going to get to that 1 million qubit, but in the 1 million qubits, but in the process, we are going to have these quantum computers that are noisy, that are not capable of implementing error correction. So while we have proof that the fault-tolerant quantum device will give you an advantage, we are not certain that the NIST device is going to be able to do something useful. So there is a demonstration that the NIST device is more powerful than the classical device in a specific, very specific task. That was the demonstration of quantum supremacy that Google published a year ago. And probably the most important direction of research right now in quantum computing is designing algorithms for those noisy devices and trying to find applications for those noisy devices. So maybe to summarize, we have proved that once we have a fault-tolerant quantum device, we'll have an advantage. In the meantime, we are trying to discover algorithms to take advantage of the noisy devices we have today. And that is one of the main focuses of Zapata.
So based on what you've told me so far through this interview, it seems like quantum computing has come so far, and it still has lots of potential in the future. Where do you see quantum computing, from your perspective, in the next 10 years? And what's your favorite part about being in the field?
So I really, what I'm currently doing in Zapata is essentially talking to companies, understanding their computational problems and trying to apply quantum computing to solve those problems. And that's really what excites me the most. Or exploring the potential that quantum computing can have for real companies for solving real world problems is what gets me more excited. And in order to do that, there's still a lot of research that needs to be done. So definitely one of the most exciting directions right now is, as I mentioned before, designing algorithms that can offer solutions to practical problems using these noise intermediate scale devices. And that is one direction. The goal for the hardware, for people working on quantum computing hardware, is to get to error correction. But in the path of going towards error correction, we will have to. We're going to have computers that are going to be increasingly more powerful, right? We're going to have 100 physical qubits, thousands of physical qubits. And there's still a lot of things that we need to discover there on how we can use those noisy devices. I think that in the future, we're going to have this intermediate regime where maybe we can use part of the quantum device to implement a few error-corrected qubits, and then the rest of the qubits are going to be physical. So studying those intermediate regimes of error correction is definitely a very exciting research direction, and definitely developing these algorithms that can improve with the quantum hardware. At Zapata, we recently developed an algorithm that, as the quantum device gets better and better in terms of fidelity, is less noisy. The algorithm allows you to extract more information from the quantum computer. So it's an algorithm that will age well, just like good wine, right? Like as the computer gets better, then you're going to be able to use the same algorithm, but to extract more information using it. So developing algorithms with those characteristics, I think, will be really important in the incoming 10 years while we live in the NISQ era.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, keep our eyes peeled at Zapata and see what you guys have coming out of the company in the next 10 years. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Romero, and coming here and speaking to us about quantum computing and the innovations taking place at Zapata.
No, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And thanks to our listeners, BEaTS Research Radio is supported by the University of Ottawa Heart Institute, the BEaTS Research Lab, the Department of Biochemistry, Microbiology, and Immunology in the Faculty of Medicine at the University of Ottawa. Our director is Dr. Emilio Alarcon. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and podcast channels. You can also follow us on Twitter to stay in the loop for new episode releases.